Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The battlefield was a desolate wasteland, scarred by the endless years of conflict between humanity and the alien Xylar. The sky, once blue, was now a hazy orange, thick with smoke from the war machines above. Massive craters dotted the surface, remnants of battles fought long ago, the earth twisted and torn by weapons far beyond the comprehension of those who fought here. Among the human forces was Captain Kira Solis, a field medic who had seen more than her fair share of bloodshed. Her silver armor gleamed faintly in the dim light as she moved quickly through the chaos, her mind focused on the task at hand. Every second counted. The sound of blaster fire echoed around her as soldiers, both human and alien, clashed in a desperate struggle for control over this barren planet. Kira didn't care about the politics. She wasn't a soldier, she was a healer, and that was her focus. Her squad, the 7th Medical Division, was always stationed near the front lines, patching up soldiers, keeping them alive long enough to return to the fight. But today, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. The war had escalated to new heights, and with each battle, fewer and fewer soldiers returned to the medbay. Kira crouched behind a broken structure, her breath steady as she checked her medkit. The team had been ambushed, and now they were scattered. She could see Corporal Jensen a few meters away, taking cover behind a fallen wall, firing his rifle. She nodded to herself. He was fine for now, but he wouldn't be if she didn't get to the wounded fast. She sprinted across the battlefield, dodging incoming fire and keeping her head low. As she approached a small ridge, she heard the unmistakable screech of an alien warship overhead. The Xylar had arrived. The humanoid aliens had been humanity's greatest threat for decades, and their technologically advanced ships could obliterate entire cities in the blink of an eye. Their soldiers were strong, ruthless, and relentless. It was no surprise to Kira that she was about to face another wave of them. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. Kira froze, her instincts kicking in. It was human, a soldier, one of her own. Without a second thought, she darted toward the sound, her boots kicking up dirt as she ran. She found him lying in a ditch, blood pooling around his body. He was barely conscious, his breath ragged, his armor pierced in multiple places. A quick scan confirmed he had minutes left at best. "Hang on," Kira muttered as she knelt beside him, unstrapping his chest armor with swift precision. "I've got you." But just as she was about to inject a stabilizer, a burst of gunfire erupted nearby. She didn't flinch. The soldier's life depended on her now. She injected the serum into his side, and almost immediately, his breathing steadied. Kira turned to grab her medkit, but that's when she heard it, a loud thud, followed by a grunt of pain. Her heart raced as she turned around. From the smoke emerged a figure unlike any human she'd seen. A Xylar soldier, wounded and limping. His dark green skin was covered in blaster burns, his silver armor dented and scorched. He collapsed in front of her, his hand reaching out toward her, eyes wide in pain. For a moment, Kira froze. A Xylar soldier? Here. Alone. She glanced at the human soldier she had just stabilized. He was breathing steadily now, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. And here, right in front of her, was an enemy soldier, suffering just as badly as her own. She could feel the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. The laws of war were clear. The Xylar were enemies, and any injured soldier should be left behind. But Kira had never been one to follow orders without thinking. She had taken an oath to save lives, regardless of the color of their blood or the banner they fought under. "Help him." The Xylar soldier rasped, his voice faint but desperate. Kira hesitated, scanning the battlefield for any sign of her squad mates, but they were too far away. If she helped him, she'd be alone. She'd risk her life, and the lives of others, for an enemy combatant. Yet, as she looked into the soldier's eyes, something in them made her pause. He wasn't some mindless killer. He was a person, just like her. She took a deep breath and made her choice. Kira knelt beside the Xylar soldier, quickly assessing the damage. His wounds were severe, but not beyond her skill. "This is going to hurt," she muttered, injecting a local anesthetic into his side. He flinched but didn't scream. As she worked, the hum of distant gunfire continued. The war raged on, but for this one moment, it felt like time had stopped. It was just Kira, the human medic, and the wounded alien soldier. The silence between them was thick. She didn't know what it meant that she was helping him. She didn't know if anyone would ever understand. But for now, all she cared about was getting him through the next few minutes. The harsh winds of the battlefield howled as Kira worked. Her hands moved with practiced precision, stitching the Xylar soldier's wounds with a calmness that belied the chaos around her. His skin, a dark green shade with patches of silvery scales, was slick with sweat, and the blood pooling beneath him mixed with the dirt and sand. His breaths were shallow, but steady. Kira glanced over her shoulder, scanning the horizon. Her squad was nowhere to be seen. They had scattered when the ambush hit, each soldier taking cover wherever they could find it. It had been mere minutes, but it felt like an eternity. If her comrades saw what she was doing, if they found out she was treating an enemy soldier, there would be no forgiveness. But she couldn't stop. Not now. She worked quickly, her medical training kicking in. The Xylar's armor was thick, almost impenetrable, but she had managed to remove the sections that were most damaged. The deeper cuts in his side were where the blaster had torn through, and the rest of his body had taken damage from shrapnel and debris. She had stabilized his vitals, but there was still more to do. The shock had set in, and it was the kind of shock that could kill even the strongest of soldiers if not treated immediately. "Come on, stay with me," she muttered to herself, applying a fresh bandage to his side. The Xylar's green eyes flickered open, locking onto hers with a sense of confusion. His pupils dilated as he tried to sit up, but the effort made him wince. Kira pressed him gently back into the sand. "Rest," she commanded, her voice firm. "You're not going anywhere yet." He blinked at her, his voice weak, barely above a whisper. "You, help me." Kira's chest tightened. She didn't respond immediately. The war between humans and the Xylar had lasted for decades, with both sides suffering catastrophic losses. The Xylar were ruthless invaders, known for their brutal tactics and overwhelming military force. They had no mercy for humans, and the humans gave none in return. For years, Kira had treated the wounds of her own soldiers, never questioning their cause. But this was different. This was an enemy soldier, one who had likely fought in the same battles that had claimed so many lives. And yet, here he was, at her mercy, his life in her hands. "Yes," she said, her voice softening. "I'm helping you." The Xylar soldier's eyes widened. He tried to speak again but seemed to lose the strength to do so, falling unconscious once more. Kira worked quietly, cleaning the rest of his wounds, making sure he wouldn't bleed out before she could move him to safety. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of her squad mates charging toward her, weapons raised, ready to drag her away from what she was doing. But no one came. Kira's heart was racing. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision she had just made. She had defied orders and gone against every instinct that had been ingrained in her as a soldier and a medic. The higher-ups in her division had always taught her that saving enemy lives was a liability. That it wasn't worth the risk. But here, in the midst of all this chaos, Kira couldn't bring herself to leave the Xylar soldier to die. He was just like any other soldier, wasn't he? A person caught in the gears of a war he had no control over. It was the smell of burning metal that snapped her out of her thoughts. The battle was still raging around her, and she needed to move. The longer she stayed in one place, the more likely it was that the enemy would find her. She had to get him somewhere safe, somewhere he could heal. She couldn't carry him alone, not with the Xylar forces closing in. But she had no choice. Kira grabbed her communicator and activated the emergency frequency. Her voice was steady, though she could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. "This is Captain Solis of the 7th Medical Division. I have a wounded Xylar soldier. Requesting immediate extraction. Over." She waited, but the response came back static-filled and incoherent. The comms were down, jammed by enemy interference. She cursed under her breath. She could try again later, but that might be too late. Her eyes darted around again. She could hear the sounds of Xylar warships overhead, and the faint hum of blaster fire from nearby skirmishes. If they didn't leave now, they would both be dead. Kira made a decision. She would move him herself. Gritting her teeth, she carefully positioned herself beneath the Xylar soldier's shoulders, trying not to disturb his wounds further. He was heavier than she expected, his alien frame solid and muscular. Kira's muscles screamed as she heaved him into a sitting position, then used every ounce of strength she had to drag him toward the nearest shelter, a collapsed building that might provide some cover. It took every ounce of energy to get him to safety. Her breathing was labored by the time they reached the structure, and she collapsed beside him, her body shaking with exhaustion. She had only been able to move a few hundred meters, but it felt like miles. Sweat trickled down her face, mixing with the dirt that had accumulated during the scramble. She paused for a moment, catching her breath, and then looked at the soldier again. He was still unconscious, but his breathing had slowed, deeper and more rhythmic. She had done all she could for now. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart jump into her throat. She was certain it was her squad, but she didn't have time to figure out who it was. She couldn't risk getting caught with a wounded enemy soldier. She had to hide him. Just as she was about to drag the Xylar soldier deeper into the shelter, a voice called out from the distance. "Kira." It was Jensen's voice. "Captain Solis. Where are you?" Relief washed over her, but only for a moment. She had to make a choice, let him know what she was doing, or keep the Xylar's existence a secret. The consequences of revealing what she had done were not something she was prepared to face. "I'm here." Kira called out, her voice tight. She quickly hid the Xylar soldier behind the debris, praying they wouldn't notice anything suspicious. Moments later, Jensen appeared, along with a few other members of her squad. They were panting, clearly having been through the ringer. His eyes quickly scanned the area, and then they landed on Kira. "You're alive." "Thank God," Jensen said, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "We've been looking all over for you. What are you doing here?" "It's too dangerous." Kira didn't answer right away. Her gaze flickered toward the spot where the Xylar soldier was hiding. The weight of her decision was already beginning to settle over her like a heavy cloak. She had made her choice, but she didn't know how long she could keep the secret from her team. "I'm fine," she said finally, trying to sound as normal as possible. "Just, taking cover for now. We need to move." Jensen nodded, his expression still worried, but he didn't press further. The squad moved in closer, ready to continue the mission. Kira's mind raced as she silently prayed the Xylar soldier would stay hidden long enough for her to figure out her next move. The hours that followed were a blur of confusion and tension. Kira had successfully hidden the injured Xylar soldier, but every passing minute seemed to stretch longer as she grappled with the weight of her decision. She could feel the strain of her disobedience, her body tense with the knowledge that, if discovered, she would be branded a traitor, or worse. The war wasn't just about victories on the battlefield, it was about loyalty. To question orders, to question the enemy's humanity, was the gravest sin a soldier could commit. Kira's squad moved cautiously through the remains of the city, heading for a makeshift command post. The sounds of distant gunfire and explosions had become background noise, barely noticeable after days of combat. Jensen kept close, his eyes scanning the ruins for any signs of danger. "Captain," Jensen's voice broke through the constant hum of adrenaline that filled Kira's mind. "We need to talk." Kira glanced at him briefly, her stomach tightening. Jensen wasn't the type to mince words, and the concern in his voice made her wonder how much he suspected. She didn't know if she was ready to face the consequences of what she had done, not just from her superiors but from her own team. "I know," she replied quietly, keeping her eyes forward. She didn't have to look at him to know that he was watching her, his sharp gaze studying her every move. He was a loyal soldier, one who followed the rules without question. But Kira had always respected his ability to read people. Now, she wasn't sure if she could keep the truth hidden much longer. They reached the makeshift command post, a few pieces of reinforced metal and concrete haphazardly assembled to form a safe zone from the chaos outside. As the squad entered, Kira was met with the usual mix of gruff greetings and reports, but her mind was elsewhere. She had to figure out how to handle the situation with the Xylar soldier. It wasn't just about saving his life anymore, it was about what would happen if anyone found out. She couldn't let that happen. "Captain Solis." Lieutenant Harper's voice pulled Kira from her thoughts. Harper was a no-nonsense officer who commanded respect from her team, and her stern gaze told Kira that something was off. "Where's your team? We were expecting you back at the rendezvous point." "We ran into some trouble," Kira replied, her voice steady. She offered a smile, but it felt forced. "Had to take cover. There's a lot of enemy activity near the perimeter." Harper didn't seem convinced. "That's not what I heard. You're the only one who isn't accounted for." Kira's heart skipped a beat. She was sure her squad had covered for her. She trusted them, but the thought of being caught in a lie, especially now, made her pulse race. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. We'll move out at first light," Kira said, turning away to avoid further scrutiny. She had to check on the Xylar soldier before anyone else noticed. "Hold on, Captain," Harper called after her, her tone sharpening. "I need a word with you." Kira froze in her tracks, her back stiffening. She turned slowly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Yes, Lieutenant." Harper studied her for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. "There's something off about you. You're not acting like yourself. You're distracted, and that's dangerous on the front lines." Kira swallowed hard. She had to stay calm. "I'm just tired, Lieutenant. You know how it is. Long days, non-stop fire." She forced herself to make eye contact, though her stomach twisted with the fear of being found out. Harper didn't seem fully convinced, but she nodded. "All right. Just, don't get sloppy out here. We need you at your best. War's not slowing down for anyone." Kira exhaled, her shoulders relaxing a fraction as Harper turned away. She had dodged the bullet, for now. But that didn't change the fact that the Xylar soldier was still behind the wall of rubble, and the longer he stayed there, the more likely someone would find him. Every moment that passed felt like a ticking clock, and Kira knew she couldn't afford to wait much longer. She had to make her move. The squad had set up camp for the night, and Kira took advantage of the quiet to slip away. Jensen was busy organizing medical supplies, and the others were preoccupied with their own tasks. Her heart pounded as she carefully moved past the barricades of crates and into the shadowed part of the ruins where she had left the soldier. The Xylar was still unconscious but breathing steadily. His chest rose and fell with each breath, and though his condition was stable, the extent of his injuries would make it difficult for him to recover without proper care. He needed a full med bay, not the makeshift treatments Kira had been able to administer in the field. She needed to get him out of there into safety, if not for his sake, then for her own peace of mind. Her fingers brushed against his skin, checking his temperature. He was still burning with fever, a sign of infection. She winced, knowing that without antibiotics, it could easily turn fatal. She needed to act fast. "Hey," a voice whispered from behind her. Kira spun, instinctively reaching for her weapon before realizing it was only Jensen, his face dimly lit by the glow of a nearby flame. "Jensen," she breathed a sigh of relief, lowering her weapon. "What are you doing here?" "I was worried," he admitted, stepping closer. "You've been acting strange. I've never seen you like this before." He paused, his eyes scanning her face. "And I know something's going on." "What's going on, Kira?" Kira's throat tightened, her mind racing. The truth hung in the air, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. She had spent years building a reputation as a dedicated and loyal medic, one who followed the rules, one who could always be counted on. If she admitted what she had done, it could destroy everything she had worked for. Worse, it could endanger the mission, and everyone she cared about. She began, but her voice faltered. She hadn't expected it to be so hard. "I'm not stupid, Kira," Jensen said softly. "I know you, and I know when something's off." "Is it the Xyler? Did you help him?" His gaze was intense, searching, and Kira could see the conflict in his eyes. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her. He knew. Somehow, he knew. "Yes," Kira said, the word heavy on her tongue. "I helped him." Jensen's eyes widened, but he didn't step back. "Why?" "He's the enemy." "I know," Kira replied, her voice a whisper. "But he's just like us. He's a soldier, Jensen. He's fighting for his people. Just like we're fighting for ours." Jensen looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he exhaled slowly. "You're breaking the code, Kira. You know that, right?" Kira nodded, her stomach churning with the truth. "I do. But I couldn't just leave him to die." For a moment, Jensen said nothing. Then, with a resigned sigh, he spoke. "I don't know if I agree with you, but I'll help. For now. But you have to make a decision soon. This can't stay a secret forever." Kira's heart raced. She didn't know if she could trust Jensen completely, but for now, she had no other choice. "Thank you," she whispered, relief flooding her. He nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Just, be careful, Kira. You're walking a fine line." As the night stretched on, Kira felt a sense of dread creep in. The path she had chosen was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But now there was no turning back. She had made a choice, and the consequences were inevitable. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Kira's decision to hide the injured Xyler soldier felt like a dark secret growing heavier with each passing hour. Every moment spent with him, every glance she stole toward the ruins where he lay hidden, filled her with a mixture of guilt and an unspoken connection. There was a part of her that couldn't deny it, she wasn't just trying to save his life. She was wondering, perhaps more than she should, what it would mean to save him, to care for him, despite everything the war had taught her. Jensen had helped, silently and without question, but the tension between them had only deepened. He knew what she had done. He hadn't said much about it after their conversation, but Kira could feel the weight of his disapproval, the silent judgment in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She wasn't sure if he understood or if he was just afraid of the consequences. Maybe both. Every night, after the squad settled down in the temporary camp, Kira would slip away to check on the Xyler soldier. He was getting worse, his fever had not subsided, and his wounds remained raw and inflamed. She had given him everything she could, bandages, some field antibiotics she'd scavenged from her own supplies, even painkillers, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. The medics on the front lines didn't have access to the high-end medical technology she knew would save him. But there was a possibility, if she could get him to the nearest medical facility, one that was closer to enemy lines but far enough to be considered neutral ground, she might be able to get him the help he needed. If she could trust the humans there. But that, too, came with its risks. Each day, Kira found herself asking the same question: was this worth it? Was she jeopardizing not only her mission, but the lives of her squad mates, for the sake of an enemy soldier? There was a growing knot in her stomach, and it wasn't just the pressure of keeping the secret. It was the moral battle inside her mind, the question of humanity, empathy, and what it meant to fight in a war that stripped away the very essence of both sides. It was early one morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the broken walls of the ruin where they had made camp, that Kira made the decision. She couldn't just sit back any longer. The Xylar soldier was barely clinging to life. If he died on her watch, it would be more than just a failure, it would be a burden she couldn't carry. She owed him more than that. She left her tent quietly, moving stealthily through the sleeping camp. The wind was harsh, biting against her skin, but it did little to stop the gnawing sense of urgency that tugged at her chest. She found Jensen standing near the camp's perimeter, watching the horizon, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. When he saw her approach, his face tightened, but he didn't speak. "I'm going to take him to the medical facility," Kira said without preamble, her voice low but firm. Jensen's eyes darkened. He crossed his arms, his posture tense, as if bracing for a confrontation. "Kira, you're putting us all at risk. If they find out..." "I know what's at stake," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the conflict in her chest. "But I can't just leave him to die. He's not the enemy anymore. He's a person. I have to try." Jensen shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't know if you're blinded by compassion, or if you've lost your mind entirely, but this could get us all killed. If the wrong people find out what you've done, the whole squad could be held responsible." "I know the risks," Kira replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if we don't help him, who will? The war's already cost us so much. We've lost too many people." Jensen seemed to hesitate, his conflicted gaze meeting hers. His expression softened for a moment, but only for a fleeting second. "And what happens when we're all dead because of this? What happens when the Xylar regroup and retaliate for what you did?" Kira bit her lip, fighting the urge to argue further. She had spent years with Jensen, relying on his guidance, his experience. But now, for the first time, she was making a decision that went against everything they had been trained for. She had to do this. She couldn't let fear stop her from saving a life. "I'm going," she said firmly. "And I'm asking you to help me." Jensen's gaze flickered to the horizon, the silent weight of the decision pressing down on him. The silence between them stretched, each of them waiting for the other to speak, to break the tension. Finally, Jensen sighed, his shoulders dropping in resignation. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll cover you. But if anyone finds out, we're both on the chopping block." Kira nodded, her relief momentary but overwhelming. She had been prepared for this, prepared for Jensen to disagree, to argue, to try to talk her out of it. But deep down, she knew she had already made up her mind. The soldier's life mattered more than anything else. Together, they moved quickly through the camp, ensuring no one saw them leave. The Xylar soldier was still unconscious when they arrived at the ruins where she had hidden him. His condition had worsened overnight, and Kira felt the overwhelming weight of her responsibility pressing on her chest. She couldn't do this alone. "We need to move him fast," she said to Jensen, who nodded without a word. Together, they gently lifted the injured soldier, being as careful as possible with his wounds. Kira's heart raced as they moved through the war-torn landscape. She had no idea how long it would take to get to the medical facility, whether it was even still functioning or whether it had been overtaken by the Xylar or any other faction. The entire area was a war zone, a wasteland of broken buildings and crumbling infrastructure. But they had to try. They moved under the cover of darkness, taking long, careful strides between ruins, avoiding the main roads and keeping out of sight from patrolling enemy forces. The longer they took, the more nervous Kira became. Every sound felt magnified, and every shadow seemed like an enemy soldier ready to strike. As they neared their destination, the medical facility came into view. It was a low, battered structure surrounded by defensive walls, but from the outside, it seemed to be in one piece. Kira's pulse quickened, but she didn't stop. They had made it this far, and they couldn't turn back now. Jensen stopped just outside the facility's perimeter, his gaze scanning the area. "We need to get inside and make sure it's safe first. Don't do anything stupid, Kira." Kira nodded, her mind spinning with thoughts of what would happen next. The facility was a neutral zone, but in this war, neutral didn't always mean safe. It was the only chance she had left. "I'll go in first," Kira said, and with one last look at Jensen, she slipped through the gap in the fence and entered the facility. The interior of the medical facility was eerily quiet, its sterile white walls dimmed by the smoke that lingered in the air from the nearby battle. The place had once been a state-of-the-art hospital, designed to treat the worst wounds from the battlefield. Now, it was little more than a hushed, abandoned sanctuary. Signs of past violence were everywhere: shattered windows, abandoned medical supplies, and the faint smell of decay that clung to the walls like a ghost. Kira took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. She had been on the front lines for months, but this felt different. This was a gamble, not just with her career, but with the lives of everyone she cared about. If anyone found out what she had done, if the Xylar soldier was discovered, it would be the end of everything. She turned to Jensen, who stood just beyond the perimeter, scanning the area. He was silent, his expression tense. Kira could tell that he was on edge, but there was nothing he could do now. They had already crossed the line. There was no turning back. "Stay here," she whispered to him, before making her way deeper into the facility. The building was mostly intact, but it had been abandoned in a hurry. Broken equipment, overturned chairs, and scattered paperwork littered the hallways. Kira moved cautiously, staying low to the ground and trying to avoid making any noise. Every step felt like it might trigger an alarm, every sound amplified in the silence. She came to a large, open room that seemed to serve as a triage area during the height of the war. Several makeshift beds lined the walls, some of them still equipped with life-saving medical devices. The room was dark, only illuminated by the faint light of the morning sun creeping through the cracks in the building. Kira hesitated before she moved farther in, listening for any signs of life. It had been quiet for too long, and the silence felt oppressive, like a thick curtain waiting to be torn back. But there was no time to waste. She had to get the Xylar soldier help, and she had to do it now. As she moved to the far end of the room, she spotted a door slightly ajar. It led to a back area where the facility's medical personnel would have operated in more normal times. Kira approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what she expected to find behind the door, whether the facility was completely empty, or if it had been taken over by another faction. She pushed the door open slowly, holding her breath, and stepped inside. The room was smaller, with a few medical bays and a few more scattered supplies. It looked like a typical trauma center, except the equipment had been left in disarray, most of it useless after the facility had been abandoned. That's when she heard a sound, a soft shuffle from the far corner. Kira froze, her heart skipping a beat. She held her breath, straining her ears to listen. The shuffle was followed by a faint cough, then the sound of someone moving. It was too early for anyone to have made it here before her, and the last thing she needed was to be discovered. "Hello." Kira called out softly, her voice low but steady. She kept her eyes trained on the shadows in the corner. There was a brief pause, then a voice, cracked with the dryness of dehydration, responded, "Who's there?" Kira's pulse raced. She stepped forward into the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "I'm here to help," she said carefully, hoping the stranger didn't recognize her accent or see through her hastily constructed story. "I'm a medic." The figure in the corner shifted, and Kira caught sight of a man, disheveled and unshaven, with bloodshot eyes. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. His uniform marked him as one of the medics from the Allied forces, a person who, under normal circumstances, would have been an ally. But right now, with the war raging, there was no room for assumptions. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. Kira kept her tone calm, concealing the tension she felt building inside her. "I'm with a unit just outside the city. We heard the facility was still operational. Thought I could find some supplies." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze flicking from her face to the empty beds and then to the supply shelves. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You've got a long way to go. The rest of the facilities are shut down. We've got nothing left. If you need supplies, I might be able to help you, but I don't have much." Kira nodded. "Anything you can spare would be appreciated." She stepped closer, noting that the man was wearing the same uniform she recognized from the Allied forces. He wasn't a soldier, but a medic, just like her. She could trust him, at least enough to get the help she needed. "I'm not supposed to be here," the man continued, his voice lowering. "I'm supposed to be back with my unit. But, they're all dead. This place is supposed to be a refuge for our people, but we've been abandoned. I'm the last one here. Don't tell anyone I'm still alive. Not unless you want us both dead." Kira's heart skipped a beat. The reality of the situation was worse than she had feared. This facility, once a beacon of hope, was now a graveyard for the abandoned and forgotten. Yet, it was still their best chance for survival. "I won't tell anyone," she said softly. "But I need your help. I've got someone who's badly injured. I need medical supplies, anything you can spare." The medic's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, he didn't respond. He seemed to be weighing his options. Finally, with a sigh, he turned and began to rummage through the shelves. "I'll help you. But this is dangerous, you know. You're risking your life, and for what? A soldier who doesn't even belong to your side." Kira's hand tightened on the strap of her pack as she fought to maintain her composure. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. But she had already crossed that line. There was no going back. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But everyone deserves a chance." The medic paused, then slowly nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "Fine. I'll help you. But be quick. There's not much time." As he gathered what supplies he could, antibiotics, bandages, a few basic medical tools, Kira's mind raced. She couldn't stay in this facility for long. She had to get the Xyler soldier stabilized, and she had to do it without drawing attention. The medic handed her a small crate of supplies and looked at her with a solemn expression. "Good luck, and get out of here fast." Kira nodded, her heart pounding. "Thank you," she whispered before quickly turning to leave the room. She moved back into the main area, her hands shaking slightly as she rechecked the crate of supplies. Every step was fraught with danger, and Kira knew it was only a matter of time before someone realized what she was doing. She had to be quick, or all would be for nothing. Outside, Jensen waited, his face tense with worry. As Kira approached, he gave her a sharp nod. "Did you get what you need?" he asked quietly. "I did," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "But we have to move fast." Jensen didn't hesitate. Without another word, he followed her as they made their way back through the facility, careful not to make a sound. Every minute they spent here was another minute they risked exposure. The gamble was far from over. The journey back to the ruins where Kira had hidden the Xyler soldier was tense, the weight of their mission pressing down on both of them with each step. The medical supplies they'd managed to secure from the abandoned facility were enough to stabilize the soldier for now, but time was running out. If his condition didn't improve soon, there was little hope left. The wind howled through the desolate city streets, the harsh gusts carrying with them the remnants of a war that never seemed to end. The smell of burning rubble still lingered in the air, a constant reminder that every step they took was fraught with danger. The world around them was a battlefield, one where the lines between friend and foe had long since blurred. And now, in the shadows of this broken city, Kira found herself risking everything, not just for her squad, not just for her own survival, but for a soldier who had once been the enemy. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that compassion was not something she could turn off just because of the uniform someone wore. The soldier she was saving had been just like her once, a human, with hopes, fears, and dreams. And now, despite everything, he was a person Kira couldn't ignore. They reached the ruin without incident, slipping inside the broken structure and making their way to the hidden corner where the Xyler soldier lay. His condition had deteriorated even further, his fever spiking as his body fought to stay alive. His breath was ragged, and every shallow inhale seemed to take all the strength he had left. Kira's heart tightened as she knelt beside him, her hands shaking slightly as she checked his vitals. She hadn't been trained to care for alien species, but the principles were the same. The soldier needed rest, fluids, and medicine. She applied the bandages more carefully than she had before, her thoughts focused solely on him as she worked. Jensen hovered nearby, his eyes constantly darting to the surrounding darkness, ever watchful. His expression was unreadable, but Kira knew what was going through his mind. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to risk everything for an enemy soldier. But he had agreed to help, even if only because there was no other choice. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the occasional sound of shifting rubble or the distant echoes of the ongoing war. Kira glanced up at Jensen, his figure silhouetted against the dim light that filtered in from the cracks in the walls. "You're quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jensen's eyes met hers for a moment before he looked away, his gaze scanning the area once more. "Just thinking," he muttered. "About what?" Kira pressed, her curiosity getting the better of her. He hesitated before speaking again. "About the price of all this. You're risking your life, our lives, for one soldier. For someone who probably would have killed us if given the chance. That doesn't sit right with me." Kira let out a slow breath, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "I know what you're thinking. I've thought about it too. But I don't think it's about him anymore. It's about something bigger. Something we've lost in all this fighting." Jensen shot her a skeptical look, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "You're talking about compassion? About humanity? Kira, we're not fighting to be human anymore. We're fighting to survive." "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the heaviness in her chest. "But that doesn't mean we have to lose who we are along the way." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Kira thought Jensen might say something else. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and began to scan the area again, as if keeping watch was the only thing he could do to stop thinking about what was happening. Kira returned to the soldier, her hands moving with practiced precision as she administered the medicine she'd stolen from the medical facility. She could feel the weight of Jensen's silence behind her, but she couldn't let it distract her. The soldier needed her. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she heard the faintest groan from the soldier. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced down at him. His eyes were still closed, his features pale, but his breathing had softened. "Hey," Kira said gently, her voice soothing. "You're going to be all right. Just stay with me." The soldier's eyelids fluttered, and he let out a low, almost imperceptible groan. For a moment, Kira thought it was just the fever, but then his eyes slowly opened, unfocused at first, then sharp as they took in his surroundings. When he saw Kira, there was a flicker of recognition in his expression, followed by a hint of confusion. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Where am I?" Kira smiled softly, her fingers brushing against his brow to wipe away the sweat. You're safe. You're with me. The Xyler soldier blinked, disoriented but still grasping for some semblance of clarity. Safe, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I don't understand. Kira nodded. You were hurt. You're still recovering. I'm keeping you safe. You're no longer my enemy. His eyes widened slightly, though pain clouded his expression. Enemy. His voice was weak, barely able to form the word. She leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. You're not my enemy anymore. Not here. I'm here to help. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The soldier's eyes searched her face, as if trying to make sense of the situation. It was clear that he had never encountered a human like her before, someone willing to help an enemy, someone willing to risk everything for him. He tried to speak again, but his words were interrupted by a fit of coughing. Kira gently placed a hand on his chest, trying to ease his discomfort. I know this doesn't make sense to you, she said, her voice calm and steady, but right now, we have a chance to do something different. To show that there's more to us than the war. More than just fighting. The soldier's brow furrowed as if he was struggling to comprehend her words. Why? Kira looked down at him, her heart heavy with the weight of her actions. Because if we don't change, if we keep fighting without remembering who we are, then none of this will matter. Not to you, not to me. The war will end, but we'll still be lost. For a moment, there was silence, and then, with great effort, the soldier nodded, as if accepting her words. His breathing had softened, and the fever seemed to have subsided, though he was still far from being out of danger. Kira glanced at Jensen, who stood in the doorway, watching them both with a mixture of skepticism and something else, something unreadable. We've done what we can for now, she said quietly, though she knew the soldier wasn't out of danger yet. Now, we wait. Jensen stepped closer, his face grim but his eyes softening slightly. You're risking everything for him, Kira. She turned to him, her gaze steady. I'm risking everything for what's left of us. What's left of who we are. The soldier closed his eyes, exhausted but seeming at peace for the first time in days. The quiet of the ruin was broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional clatter of debris shifting in the wind. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Inside the dark, makeshift shelter, Kira and Jensen kept watch over the Xyler soldier, whose life still hung in the balance. The drug she had administered seemed to have slowed his decline, but the road to recovery was long and uncertain. The soldier lay unconscious on the makeshift cot, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Kira stayed close, her eyes never leaving him. She had done everything she could, and yet she knew there was still so much more to be done. She couldn't afford to relax, not yet, not while the soldier's future was in her hands. Jensen, sitting across the room, was lost in his thoughts. The tension in the air had reached a boiling point, and Kira could sense it. Every moment spent here felt like a countdown, like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone, somewhere, knew what they were doing and would stop at nothing to put an end to it. You're quiet again, Kira finally said, breaking the silence. Jensen looked up, meeting her eyes with a level of intensity that was hard to ignore. He hesitated before speaking, clearly torn. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. If anyone finds out what we're doing, we're dead. And so is he. Kira nodded but didn't break her gaze from the soldier. I know the risks. But what's the alternative? Leave him to die just because he wore the wrong uniform? Because we've been taught to hate him? That's not who we are. Jensen's eyes darkened, a mix of frustration and sadness crossing his features. I used to believe that too. But look around, Kira. This war, this conflict, it's destroyed everything. The lines between right and wrong have blurred. There's nothing left of the people we were before. Kira's voice softened, her words careful but firm. Maybe that's true. But we still have a choice. And that's something the war can't take from us. The room fell into silence once more, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jensen said nothing, but Kira could see the conflict in his eyes, the strain of too many hard choices and too much bloodshed. His words were laced with the bitterness of a man who had seen too much, lost too much. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Kira could still see the man who believed in something greater than just survival. Kira's thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the Xylar soldier. She immediately rose to her feet, her heart racing. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, there was confusion that quickly turned into recognition. His gaze locked onto Kira's, and though he was weak, there was something in his eyes that told her he remembered her, even if only vaguely. How long has it been?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "A few days," Kira replied, moving closer to adjust his bandages. She made sure to keep her movements gentle, mindful of his fragility. "You're still alive, though. That's all that matters right now." The soldier's eyes flickered with disbelief. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Kira paused, her fingers hovering over his bandages as she thought about the question. Why had she chosen to save him? Why had she risked everything for a soldier who had once been her enemy? The answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't something that could be explained away in a few words. "I'm doing it because," she hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Because we have to be better than the war. We have to remember who we were before all this started." The soldier looked at her, his gaze searching, as if trying to understand. "You risked your life for me. After everything my people have done, after everything my army has done to yours, to you." Kira's eyes softened, and she took a deep breath. "I know what your people have done. I'm not blind to it. But I don't believe you're just a part of that army. You're more than that. You're not just the enemy. You're a person." The soldier's eyes shone with something that almost looked like hope, mixed with pain. He struggled to sit up, his body weak and trembling from the effort. "What happens now? What are we supposed to do now, after everything? After all that's been lost?" Kira gave him a small, sad smile. "We survive. And we make sure that what comes after this war is different. For all of us." As the soldier closed his eyes again, trying to gather strength, Kira glanced over at Jensen, who had remained silent through the exchange. His arms were crossed tightly across his chest, and his jaw was clenched. She could see the inner battle raging in him, the unwillingness to accept what they were doing, and yet the deep understanding that he, too, was tied to this decision. A sound from outside cut through the tension in the room, a faint, metallic creak followed by a muffled thud. Kira's heart skipped a beat. Jensen immediately stood up, moving toward the entrance. He motioned for Kira to stay behind cover. "Someone's coming," he murmured, his voice low. Kira felt her stomach drop as she silently grabbed her rifle from the corner. There was no time to explain, no time to prepare. The sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing closer with every passing second. Kira moved to the edge of the room, her body tensed and ready. They had to act fast. Jensen gestured for her to stay put, then quietly slipped out of the room. Kira's breath caught in her throat as she tried to listen, the pounding of her heart growing louder in her ears. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside. Then, the door creaked open. Kira's hand gripped her rifle tighter, her finger resting on the trigger, her eyes locked on the opening. The figure that appeared in the doorway wasn't a soldier. It wasn't even one of the enemy. It was someone she hadn't expected to see at all. A human. A soldier from her own side. The man stood in the doorway, his eyes flicking between Kira and the soldier on the cot. His uniform was dusty, his face smeared with grime, but there was no mistaking the recognition in his eyes as he spotted the Xylar soldier. You're the one who's been hiding him, the soldier said, his voice low and dangerous. Kira's blood ran cold. There was no pretending anymore. The truth was out. And now, they would have to pay the price. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.